Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. The brown bags have been offered since the mid-1980s. With a couple of exceptions some years ago, the brown bag topics for a year are not thematic. However, in light of Nebraska's 150th celebration of statehood, the Society this year sponsored brown bags related to the theme of Peoples of Nebraska. This is the last program of that series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum at 15th and P Street in Lincoln. The programs have a live audience, are broadcast on access channels in Lincoln, Omaha, Bellevue, Hastings, North Platte, Grand Island, Papillion, South Sioux City, Blair, Bassett, Chadron, Sidney, and Beatrice, and are posted on YouTube. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Society's programs and services, can be found on the Society's website at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership include subscriptions to Nebraska History Magazine, the Society's newsletter, use of a microfilm printer reader in the Society's library archives to make free copies from microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic landmarks, discounts in the landmark store, which is found here in the museum as well as at the state capitol and at Chimney Rock, and reduced fees for kids' classes, tours, after-hours events, and similar activities where there is a fee. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast programs on public access television across the state and on the Society's YouTube page. More specifically, today is extra special because production costs for this program are underwritten by Jeff Searcy and the Searcy team of Home Real Estate. These production costs include the talents of the City of Lincoln TV fellows here with us today. For those of you who love Nebraska history as Jeff does, contact us about sponsoring a future brown bag, please. To find these videos on YouTube, it's easy. Type in your browser www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical. Click on playlists and you will go to a new page. There you will see a list labeled 2017, a subsection to house this special sesquicentennial brown bag series, Peoples of Nebraska. Just below that subsection, you will see a subsection labeled Brown Bag Lectures that has over 160 other past brown bags available on YouTube. Today, our speaker is Mike Smith. Mike was born and raised in Freeport, Illinois. He earned bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Minnesota. He has served as executive director of the Tennessee Historical Commission, director of the Michigan Historical Museum, director and CEO of the Putnam Museum in Iowa, president and CEO of the Buffalo Museum of Science in New York, and president and CEO of the American Textile History Museum in Massachusetts. From 2006 to 2016, He served fabulously as director and CEO of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Mike's topic is Meet Members of the Nebraska Hall of Fame. Just to let you know about asking questions, Mike prefers you wait until the end to ask. Please join me in welcoming Mike Smith.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Nice to be here today. Nice to see so many friends on what looks like kind of a rainy, icy day out there. We're going to explore today one of the more interesting institutions in the state, at least in my mind, and that's the Nebraska Hall of Fame. Put a little context to this. Halls of Fame are somewhat ubiquitous across America today. The most widely known is probably the Baseball Hall of Fame. Let's see if this works. In Cooperstown, New York. Anybody been there? A few. Good. All right. Close behind, maybe the National Football League Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. The National College Football Hall of Fame, which contains a lot of Nebraska graduates, in South Bend, Indiana. And in the U.S. Capitol, we have Statutory Hall. Bob and I were just talking about that before the lecture. Almost every college and high school has their athletic Hall of Fame. In Nebraska, you can visit the Nebraska High School Athletic Association Hall of Fame. In fact, it's difficult to imagine an organization that has failed to honor some of its graduates or past leaders with inclusion in some kind of a Hall of Fame. In 2002, when I served, as John mentioned, the president of the American Textile History Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts, we initiated the American Textile Hall of Fame, which I found wasn't in existence. So we started one, and it was enthusiastically received, helped us to raise money, and make new friends for that museum. Reasons for the Halls of Fame are many, it seems to me. Humans seem naturally to honor past achievements and those who've accomplished great deeds, as each culture may identify those. Among Native Americans, there wasn't really a Hall of Fame, but those deeds and those individuals were entered into the oral traditions that were passed down from generation to generation. The Romans, of course, filled their city with triumphant arches, as did Napoleon with his Arc de Triomphe in Paris. I'm sure some of you have seen that. The Catholic Church canonizes its heroes, and on and on. Thus, it was not necessarily unusual when the people of Germany began what I would consider the modern practice of establishing memorial halls in the 19th century. And that led in 1901 to New York University establishing the Hall of Great Americans in the Bronx in New York. I have not been there. Has anybody been there? Well, it still is in existence, although the New York University is no longer using that campus. It's now the Bronxville campus, Bronxville Community College. But the Hall of Great Americans is still there, and apparently still has some traction, for they recently removed Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. I'm not sure they've added anybody, but they've removed a couple, and we won't talk about that issue today. I have strong feelings on that. Perhaps strangely, being here today to talk about the Nebraska Hall of Fame, few American states actually have a Hall of Fame. Our closest neighbor with such is South Dakota. In Chamberlain, South Dakota, the South Dakota Hall of Fame, a freestanding building, its criteria and its operation, I think, are much different. In fact, I know are much different than what we do in Nebraska. They have some 15 or 17 categories by which they qualify people for the South Dakota Hall of Fame. And unlike Nebraska, there is no waiting period. You can be installed immediately. And in fact, each year, as I understand it, they install an Artist of the Year and a Writer of the Year. But then, of course, we're here in Nebraska, and we know there's no place like Nebraska. Our Hall of Fame, housed in our national landmark state capitol, began somewhat, I think, as an accidental manner in the May 1961 gift of a marble bust of U.S. Senator George Norris to the state of Nebraska. Norris, who I would consider the greatest Nebraskan, given his many accomplishments, over 4 decades of service in the Congress and U.S. Senate. That gift came from the Norris family. Well, that was in 1961 in May. Just 2 weeks later, another bust showed up. They weren't falling from the sky, but they were showing up. A bust of Nebraska's permanent poet laureate, John G. Neihardt. That bust had been executed by Neihardt's sculptor wife, Mona, in 1942. At the same time, there was a bill in the legislature, LB 693, to establish a Hall of Fame. 2 busts came in. I'm not sure all this related together, but it didn't take the legislature just a few days to debate and pass LB 693. That law went into effect on June 22nd, 1961, under an emergency clause. I couldn't tell you what the emergency was, thereby establishing both the Nebraska Hall of Fame and the Nebraska Hall of Fame Commission, which is composed of 6 members appointed to 6-year terms by the governor, with no more than 3 from a single political party. In addition to those 6 is the director of the Nebraska State Historical Society, who serves by virtue of that position, and the governor, him or herself, who serves on an ex officio basis. There's actually 8 members of that Hall of Fame Commission. It is administered, has been since that passage of LB 693, by the Nebraska State Historical Society. At that time, a new and I believe noteworthy state institution was born, one which continues to this day, offering both opportunities and I would say challenges to those of us who seek to preserve and present the story of the state and its people. The legislation talks about inducting members who are prominent and outstanding. Those are the 2 words that are in the legislation, which of course may be defined in different ways by different people at different times. I was on one awards committee one time which banned the word outstanding because everybody that came before it was outstanding in some ways. But those 2 words I think are important, and they remain important no matter how they may be defined at any particular place and time. First I'm going to talk to you about who's enshrined up on the 2nd floor of the Capitol. We'll run through those. Then we'll review the criteria and the process for how this happens. So let's get started. For each of these inductees, I'm going to give their name and show a slide of the bust that's in the Capitol. Talk about the Nebraska place with which they seem to be most affiliated, the dates of birth and death, the year elected to the Hall of Fame, and perhaps just a comment or 2 on the accomplishments. So we're going to start with George W. Norris of Mccook, who was elected in 1961. He was born in 1861 and died in 1944. State and national political leader, reformer of the U.S. House of Representatives, founder of the unicameral, and father of the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Rural Electrification Administration. 1961, moving along to Willa Cather, who was elected in 1962. Of course, associated with Red Cloud, internationally renowned Pulitzer Prize winner in 1924. In her writing, she opens the world to the immigrant experience of the prairies and plains, and modern literary critics would consider her as one of the top 5 writers in the U.S. history of either gender. Wonderful, amazing Nebraska lady. John J. Pershing, General of the Army. He was associated with Lincoln due to his time that he served at the university. Born in 1860, died in 1948, elected in 1963, the 3rd inductee. While he was here at Nebraska, he served as commander of the ROTC program, Army ROTC program, where he founded the Student Precision Drill Unit that is still known as the Pershing Rifles. In 1916, he chased Pancho Villa along the Mexican-American border, was promoted to commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in World War I, led our forces in France, served as U.S. Army Chief of Staff from 1921 to 1924. I think one of the most significant achievements, and during World War I, when the doughboys went to France, the British and the French were very interested in using the American soldiers as fill-ins, replacements for on their own units. Where a British unit might be down 25%, they'd fill those in with 25% of American boys. Pershing fought very hard and very successfully that American units would fight independently as American units, and that they would remain under American commanders. And I think that perhaps that was his hardest fight in his entire life, but one that he was very significant in winning. We'll go to the 4th inductee, Edward J. Flanagan, Father Flanagan. Born in 1886 in Ireland and died in 1948 in Ireland. He was elected in 1965, of course associated with Omaha, Irish Catholic priest and founder of Boys Town in 1917, just 100 years ago, which is known today around the world for its work with young people and its medical care. The process of his canonization, which is not assured, of course, but the process is underway in the Catholic Church. He was perhaps made most famous, I would think, by the 1938 biographic film in which Spencer Tracy portrayed Father Flanagan. And I think it's a favorite of mine, and we all remember Mickey Rooney playing in that film. Father Flanagan was inducted in 1965. Well, 2 years later was the next inductee, William Frederick Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill. Associated, of course, with North Platte. He was born in Iowa in 1846 and died in Colorado in 1917. Iowa-born Pony Express rider, frontier scout, professional buffalo hunter, entrepreneur, and showman. Awarded the Medal of Honor in the Indian Wars, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And certainly across the world was the most famous American of his time, by far, known throughout the world. Buffalo Bill. William Jennings Bryan, associated, of course, with Lincoln, born 1860, died 1925. Selected or elected in 1971, populist politician, one of America's greatest orators of his time, presidential candidate several times, Secretary of State in the Wilson administration, and resigned rather than support Woodrow Wilson's call for America to enter World War I. Outspoken defender of the biblical account of creation in the famous Scopes trial in Tennessee, another movie you may be aware of. And Bryan Medical in Lincoln, of course, carries his name, preserves his home on the Bryan East campus, one of our greatest Nebraskans. Also in 1971, Bess Streeter Aldridge was elected to the Hall of Fame, associated with the town of Elmwood, where she lived for many years. Born in 1881, also in Iowa, died in 1954. Independent book and magazine author with a national audience, recounter of the women's frontier experience, and as a widow, she supported her family with her typewriter. Great lady. Now we're back to John G. Neihardt. That bust of his showed up in 1961, but it wasn't until 1974 that he was elected. Neihardt was born in Illinois, of course associated with Bancroft here in Nebraska. Born 1881, died 1973. In 1921, the legislature made him the Poet Laureate of Nebraska, the permanent Poet Laureate of Nebraska. Highly regarded for his Black Elk Speaks, published in 1932, is still read widely in the schools, and also highly regarded for his Cycle of the West poetry and for his whole range of poetry, including his lyrical poems that he wrote. Neihardt, of course, left Nebraska and went on to a career in Missouri. I'm not sure if that held up as his election, but he was elected in 1974, and that bust found a place in the Hall of Fame. Here we have J. Sterling Morton, Nebraska City, born 1832, died 1902. Elected in 1975, he served as territorial secretary, came to Nebraska and served as territorial. Well, he came to Nebraska after he was kicked out of the University of Michigan, to be honest about it. Came to Nebraska, served as territorial secretary, and twice for short periods as acting territorial governor. Long career, and a good career, as Democratic politician, newspaper publisher, publicist for the Burlington Railroad line, founder of Arbor Day, which is probably what he's best known for today. His statue is in the U.S. Capitol in Statutory Hall. Actually, I think today it's in the new Visitor Center underneath the Capitol. Built Arbor Lodge, which today, of course, is a state historic site in Nebraska City. So we're seeing a lot of different leaders, men and women. Grace Abbott, associated with Grand Island. Born 1878, died 1939, elected 1976. Nationally recognized social worker and reformer. She headed the U.S. Children's Bureau from 1921 to 1934. U.S. delegate to the Advisory Committee on Traffic and Women and Children of the League of Nations in 1923. And she was an advisory member of the War Labor Policies Board on the employment of children in the war industries 1917 to 18. When it came to children's welfare, Grace Abbott was there at the head of any campaign to protect and advance the welfare of our children. Nathan Roscoe Pound, born in Lincoln, 1870, died in 1964, elected in 1976. So we have two, and we will have three elected in 1976. University of Nebraska trained botanist and ecologist, teacher of the law, dean of the law schools at the University of Nebraska, and then at Harvard University, is said to have reinvented, really, I think is a term, the teaching of the law. So he is the third elected in 1976, the bicentennial year, was Maury Sandoz, of course associated with the Nebraska Sandhills, born there in Rushville, 1896, died in 1966 in New York City. Elected in 1976, as I mentioned. Biographer, her book Old Jules was published in 1935. Historian, wrote Cheyenne Autumn, Crazy Horse, The Beavermen, The Cattlemen. A novelist, she wrote Capital City and Slocum House. At one time, she was employed by the Nebraska State Historical Society as assistant editor of Nebraska History. I'd like to get that in. An essayist, resident in the Sandhills in Lincoln and Denver and New York City. And if you haven't read Love Song to the Plains, which is a lyrical history of the plains and really of Nebraska, which was published in 1961, I would really encourage you to do that. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Maury Sandoz, elected in 1976. Standing Bear, Ponca and Omaha, associated with those two communities, born 1829, died in 1908. Elected in 1977. Tribal leader, plaintiff in Indian rights trial of 1879, in which Judge Elmer Dundee ruled that Native Americans are indeed citizens under the law. Great, great triumph. Wondered why it took so long, was so hard, but it was nevertheless a triumph. Nationally known speaker for Indian rights, and as I said, elected in 1977. All these busts, of course, are up on the second floor of the Capitol. Robert Furness of Brownville, born 1824, died in 1905, elected in 1980, pioneer, Nebraska agricultural leader, newspaperman and governor from 1873 to 1875, co-founder of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Today his home in Brownville is owned and operated by the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. Governor Furness. Edward Creighton, associated of course with Omaha, born 1820, died 1874, elected 1982. Many hats he wore: businessman, banker, cattleman, investor, builder of one part of the transnational telegraph line, philanthropist. He loaned, I don't think this was philanthropy, he loaned Brigham Young $50,000 to support the Mormon exodus to Utah in 1848 and 49. His family later gave funds for the establishment of the Creighton University in Omaha. He must have been a sizable man based on that bust. Suzette LaFleche Tibbles was a very small person based on her bust. She was born and associated with Bancroft from the extremely influential LaFleche family. Born 1854, died 1903. Dedicated advocate and spokesperson for the Omaha tribal people and for all Native Americans. She was involved, along with her husband, Thomas Tibbles, in the trial, which Standing Bear was associated. A writer, a great leader of her people. She was elected in 1983. Gilbert N. Hitchcock, hiding behind his newspaper here, associated with Omaha, born 1859, died 1934. Elected in 1984. Newspaperman, Democrat, member of the House of Representatives twice, 1903 to 5 and 1907 to 11. U.S. Senator from 1911 to 23. He supported Woodrow Wilson, and this was an unsuccessful support, for Woodrow Wilson to try to achieve ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, and also the establishment of the League of Nations. Well, the American Congress never did, the Senate did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, but the League of Nations was established. Hitchcock was a strong leader. Loren Eiseley, I think one of the maybe two, and they come up here one after another, but Loren Eiseley Born 1907, grew up here in Lincoln, on the outskirts of Lincoln, which is no longer the outskirts of Lincoln. Died 1977 in Philadelphia. Elected in 1986. He's an anthropologist, a poet, a philosopher of science, an author, and one of two pure intellectuals that we have in our Hall of Fame. Really known for his books. I hope you've read at least one of those. Hartley Burr Alexander, I would consider our second pure intellectual. Associated with Lincoln, born 1873, died 1939, inducted 1988. University of Nebraska classicist, philosophy professor, poet, writer. Was a key participant in the design team for the Nebraska Capitol, authored the texts that you'll find in the Capitol, and developed the philosophical underlayment for the art that's in the Capitol in many places. And really brought that building into the history of government, democracy, and world history. And I don't think I need to say to this crowd how important that building is, not only for Nebraska, but really for our nation. Hartley Burr Alexander. Arthur Thompson, Colonel Thompson, Arthur W. Thompson, associated with Lincoln. Born 1886, died 1970, elected 1990, said to have been the Dean of American Auctioneers, especially in terms of selling cattle. He was said to have called over 7,500 auctions, ranging from Canada to Mexico and East Coast to the West Coast. Our Colonel, of course, came with the role of auctioneer, Colonel Thompson. Dwight Griswold, associated with Gordon, born 1893, died 1954, elected 1993. Banker, journalist, wartime governor of Nebraska from 1941 to 47. Then the next year he took on the role as head of the successful U.S. mission providing financial aid to Greece when it was after the war. Of course, all the European nations were on their backs. They were broke. And there was concern that socialist elements or communist elements would take the governments of these Western nations. Greece was very great concern, and President Truman and the Congress provided financial support for Greece, and Governor Griswold was the head of that program, for which and then later he served in the United States Senate. Died while in his term. Nathan Gold of Lincoln, born 1894, died 1970, elected 1996, Nebraska Lincoln department store operator, civic leader and philanthropist, strong supporter of the Nebraska State Historical Society. I like to get that in. He was elected in 1996. Then there was a 4-year hiatus. The next person elected was in 2000, Red Cloud, born up in Gordon, what is today Gordon County, associated with the Northern Plains. Born 1821, died 1909, lived a very long life. Elected 2000, as I said. A Lakota warrior and war chief. He defeated the U.S. in the war over the Bozeman Trail that was opened from the Oregon Trail in Wyoming, north into Montana during 1864 and 65. Negotiated the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1866, which he felt, and other leaders felt, preserved much of what is today South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana as the land, including the Black Hills, as the land of the Lakota people. Later, a practical voice among the Lakota for accommodation with the whites. I think he came east and found out how many of us there were. Thus considered a statesman today, and I think quite correctly, by both white society and by the government of his time. So another great leader, and one of the two Native American men in the Hall of Fame. Two of the last three I've had some association with. Charles Edwin Bessie, associated with Lincoln, born 1845, died 1915, I'm sorry. Elected 2007, pioneering botanist, ecologist, forester, creative and inspiring teacher and administrator. He initiated the concept of the agricultural experiment stations across the country, was instrumental in acquiring federal sign-on to that program, served as chancellor of the University of Nebraska, planted the Bessie National Forest in the Sandhills, the nation's largest hand-planted forest. He was elected in 2007. Alvin Saunders Johnson was born on a farm up in Dakota County, died in New York City. He was born in 1874, died in 1971. Elected 2012, highly respected economic theorist who earned his undergraduate degree at the university. He taught at major universities in California, Texas, and New York, among other places. He's a published novelist, co-founded the New School for Social Sciences in New York City and led it for years. A leader in finding ways to bring Jewish intellectuals out of Europe during the 1930s as they were being threatened by the Nazi regime, provided means for them to earn a living in the U.S. once they got here. He was also noted for drafting the first civil rights law in the United States in conjunction with Governor Thomas Dewey of New York in the period after World War II. He was elected in 2012. And the most recent electee, for whose bust is not yet done, I don't believe, Thomas R. Kimball of Omaha, associated with Omaha, born 1862 in Cincinnati, died in 1934, elected just this year, 2017. He was trained in architecture in Boston and Paris. He co-founded an influential professional publication, the Architectural Record. He came back to Omaha from the East Coast to become the leading Nebraska architect of his day. Designed significant buildings in Omaha, let's say one, for example, St. Cecilia's Cathedral. He created, and this is, I think, very important, he created an innovative double-blind competition for the new Nebraska State Capitol, which led to the building we have today, and oversaw the building of this National Historic Landmark. He will be inducted next year, probably, I believe, the commission members here next year. And we'll come back to some issues that touch on this. So in summary, we have 19 white men, 4 white women, 2 Native American men, and 1 Native American woman who've been elected to our Hall of Fame, no African Americans, and no Latinos to this point in time. So that's who's up there. I'm going to leave him up there. We'll talk now about the qualifications required to be considered for the Nebraska Hall of Fame. And I can tell you this, none of you are qualified. You have to be deceased for 35 years. So unless somebody has passed away and I don't know about it, you're not qualified. So you have to be deceased at the time of induction, for 35 years at the time of induction. People who are born in Nebraska are qualified. If you're not born in Nebraska, and many of our inductees have not been born in Nebraska, including the most recent electee, Kimball, the commission will look at achievements and prominence that work and a prominence achieved while living in Nebraska, or that your time in Nebraska strongly influenced what you accomplished in your life. So if you're born in Nebraska, if you're not born in Nebraska, still all right. But you have to be dead for 35 years. There are reasons for that, I think good reasons for that. The commission has held, in addition, that popular celebrity or success in athletics are considered not being of lesser value and lower priority in the selection of inductees. That may be changed at some time, but that's really been the thinking of the commission going all the way back. It's not an athletic hall of fame. It's not a hall of fame of famous rock musicians or others who've come, or actresses or people who are in the popular culture. It's really for cut above in some ways. Of the 26 elected to date, it is fair to say that at least 17 were well known across the state when they were selected. That is to say, they would have been recognizable or are recognizable names to citizens whose education included Nebraska history and U.S. history, or who read the relevant historical markers, which everybody should do, or people who were generally interested in the story of Nebraska and the Great Plains. Some, like Dwight Griswold or Gilbert Hitchcock, were men who ran for statewide office and were certainly familiar to voters. Lincoln shoppers, I presume, knew Golds and maybe had an opinion of the man who ran the store. Colonel Thompson must have been familiar to and well known by anyone in the cattle business. The last 3, however, elected, Bessie, Johnson, and Kimball, I would suggest were relatively unknown except to those who had particular academic training. Botany, for example, or forestry, or architecture, or economics. Johnson, and I was struck by this at the time the commission was looking at this nomination, was almost unknown here in Nebraska, having lived in Nebraska only as a youth and while in college. My point is that popular fame or renown was certainly a factor for some, but need not be. We can elect people who knew very little about. Of course, they have to be nominated. We'll get to that. You've also noted, perhaps, that the process was fairly steady in its first 40 years, from 1961 through the election of Red Cloud in 2000. Since then, it has slowed considerably. The roots of this change go back, I believe, to the selections of members Thompson and Gold in the 90s. Both were selected within 26 years of their deaths. For at that time, the 35 years provision was not in the statute. Thus, perhaps they had family or friends, and I wasn't here, but perhaps they had family or friends or children of friends who had a clear interest in these candidates and might have brought some pressure to bear on the commission. I don't know. It's a historian to really want to research that if someone wants to. Second, both were apparently fine men. Nathan Gold, highly regarded in Lincoln and beyond, and a strong friend to the Historical Society. Colonel Thompson was said to have waived his fees when he was having to auction off a family's livelihood or personal possessions during hard times on the farm. It can and was argued, however, that perhaps they did not rise to the level of accomplishment and broad influence during their lives, or did they leave the legacies in history that those had who were selected before them. In other words, it appeared to some to be the beginning of an old boy selection system. And I don't think Nebraskans, in fact, I know Nebraskans don't favor that. That's just some opinion. While the Red Cloud selection in 2000 was well-deserved and generally popular, the unrest resulting from the selections made in the 1990s blew up into a crisis in 2004, and I'm thankful I wasn't here for that. As is usual with cultural changes and resulting outrage, it was clear that few saw it coming. The issue in 2004 was the homophobic statements and activities on the part of Nebraska's U.S. Senator Kenneth Weary, who defeated George Norris in 1942 and served in the U.S. Senate from 1943 until he died there in 1951, died of cancer. He was selected for induction by the commission in 2004. More background, an article printed in Nebraska Historical Society's Nebraska History Journal argued that Weary had actively worked, and certainly not by himself, but had actively worked to remove homosexuals from employment in the federal government, particularly in the State Department, where he felt they were subject to Russian or communist blackmail. This all took place during the time of the Red Scare tactics fomented by Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy beginning in 1949 and continuing really through the early 1950s. This kind of background hit this argument about Weary's views on homosexuality and other issues. He was not a quiet man or a man who held his views on his cuff. Hit the commission without warning, as these types of things almost always do. In addition, and perhaps fortunately, the commission had not selected Weary in an open meeting with a public vote. That's in violation of the Open Meetings Act in Nebraska, as an opinion came from the Attorney General's office on that issue, and that opinion was asked for by the Lincoln Journal-Star. Before that, as I understand it, what I've read is that the commission generally elected their inductees in closed session. It's easier to talk in closed session. There were two results of the Weary situation. He did not join the Hall of Fame. And second, in its next session in the legislature in 2005, further refined the criteria and laid out a clear selection process. The statute was changed to require that an inductee has to be dead for 35 years, and I won't say that again. And only one inductee can be chosen in a 5-year window. So we went from times when they could elect someone almost every year, if they chose, to a 5-year window in which there would only be one inductee. Thus, Bessie was elected in 2007, Johnson in 5 years later, 2012, 5 years later, Kimball in 2017. This goal was, and I believe is, to get back to choosing the types of inductees that the Hall had in its first 30 years. I think this has been successful. Process. Anyone can nominate someone for the Nebraska Hall of Fame. You don't have to live in Nebraska. You can be anywhere in the world, make a nomination. It's a completely open process. NSHS gets the word out via newspapers, radio, website, any way we can. Thus, anyone can access and complete the nomination form and submit such supporting documentation as they wish. I've seen documentation as a single letter. I've seen documentation piled up about that height on my desk. Read every word of it. Anyone can access and complete the nomination. Of course, nominees must meet the basic requirements in the judgment of the commission. The process is now stated in the statute is as follows. For the first 2 years, the nominations are open. And they can be open forever, but they generally come in the December 31st of the second year. And they do, I'm not kidding. And those are reviewed by the commission, which meets shortly after that time, to what the legislature in its legislation called finalists, to get a list of finalists. My experience with the commission is it generally looked at, do they really qualify, which I think is very appropriate. They're reviewed by the commission and eliminated those that don't fit the letter or the spirit of the criteria. For example, University of Iowa 1939 Heisman Trophy Award winner Niall Kinnick, who died in training during World War II, was nominated 1 year. I think it was 2012, or before 2008 or 9 when we were beginning the process. And he was nominated on the basis that he played his senior year of high school football at Benson in Omaha. Well, he did. Commission said, well, he's not really a Nebraskan, he's really an Iowan. And they've got the stadium named after him. What more do they want? So they really sort that out. Then in years 3 and 4 of this 5-year process, the commission is now required to hold one public meeting in each of the 3 Nebraska congressional districts for the purpose of receiving testimony on those who have been nominated and are actively being considered. In the past 3 cycles, the commission has held public meetings in Lincoln and hearings in Norfolk and Omaha. The 3rd district meetings have been held for a while. One time we did it in North Platte, and I think more recently at Holdridge. So the commission gets out, listens to the people who come. Then, written and oral testimony in hand, the commission holds a selection meeting in Lincoln. It is open to the public, and the commission's discussion and vote are in public, as is required. They do not need to be unanimous. In the year 5, the selected is named and inducted, formally inducted into the Hall of Fame. The bust is unveiled during my 2 times through this process. We did that in the old Senate chamber up in the Capitol. Marvelous place to do this kind of thing. A great ceremony, and when you see it, you really should attend if you can. It's a very touching ceremony. Then comes the bust. You've seen pictures of the busts. I consider this to be some heavy lifting, and to me it remains a problem in the process the legislature has not yet addressed. This is a matter of raising money for the bust to be placed in the Capitol. There is at present time no appropriation for this purpose, and the commission has no statutory responsibility, and I would think authority, to find the money. This throws the task back on the nominator or nominators of the elected honoree. Knowledge of this, of course, has discouraged some who would otherwise have nominated a candidate, and it's understandable. $20,000 plus, and $20,000 is a bargain for the design and the preparation and then the final casting of the bust. $20,000 is not for a piece of statuary is not necessarily easy to find. Funding the bust of Dr. Bessie was not a concern. We didn't have to worry about it. The University of Nebraska, led by President at that time, J.B. Milliken, was a nominator for Dr. Bessie, an active supporter, and they found funds, surprisingly, at the UN Foundation. A very easy way to handle that. On the other hand, the supporters of Alvin Saunders Johnson scrambled to find the money, which ultimately came largely from his extended remaining family. Now, this could be interpreted, and we have argued this on occasion, that this is sort of, you have to have the money to get into the Hall of Fame. I don't think that's a good idea. I really think that in Nebraska, a public institution, which a Hall of Fame is, should be supported throughout its process by public funds. The Historical Society puts funds in out of its appropriations. But if a nominator cannot see his or her way to the means of gathering $20,000 or more for the bust, should a nomination be submitted? This is a question that lingers, and I do think that we as citizens should take this up. I would argue that public funds, which we have a trust fund in which private funds are placed. It would be very easy for the legislature to appropriate a limited amount of money, say $5,000 a year, I think is what we talked about with them the last time. It would accumulate over 4 years. There would be $20,000 as a base invested by the state treasurer, held for that purpose, which would be then available to place this publicly honored honoree in our state capitol. Now, I must say that, and the bust, of course, has to have a base to sit on and has to have an identifying plaque. Fortunately, the Office of the Capitol Commission has always stepped up out of its funds, appropriated funds, to prepare and furnish the Indiana limestone base for mounting the bust and the bronze plaque listing the name and honors. That's been very helpful. So those of us who have been or are in state government have really put money into this and effort into this, which we should. I just think we need some public funding for the bus in the future. Now there's another whole important group of people in our Hall of Fame by statute. These are the members of the Nebraska Hall of Fame who are the Nebraska qualified recipients of the Medal of Honor and whose names are listed on the memorial plaque. Here I show the 3 different Medals of Honor, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Talk a little bit about those. And I'm not supposed to look up there, but you can see the plaque. This plaque was originally, which is called for in the statute, memorial plaque, which was originally mounted in the north hall of the second floor of the Capitol. And in 2014, we prevailed upon the Capitol Commission that perhaps not many people could see it or pay much attention to it in the shadows, and maybe there were lobbyists in front of it, I'm not sure. So we prevailed upon the Capitol Commission to approve a new plaque and its relocation to a more prominent memorial chamber on the Capitol's 14th floor. Has anybody here not been to the 14th floor? If you haven't been, you won't admit it, but you really need to go. At that time, Nebraska State Historical Society historian Jim Potter did extensive research regarding the names on the plaque and clarified exactly who should be honored there. As I recall, there were 2 recipients from the Indian Wars who had the same name. There were other just questions about who should be on it, particularly from the 19th century. Thanks to Jim's work, today the plaque that you see on the screen and you will see on the 14th floor has the correct listing. Medal of Honor dates back to the early days of the Civil War when there were no medals in place for service or gallantry in combat. Surprising us today, I guess. In 1861, the Navy instituted a Medal of Valor. In the following year, 1862, the United States Army initiated the Medal of Honor, as we call it today. Over the following 8 decades, there were a number of changes and adjustments, especially in determining who qualified for the medal, which is awarded by the President in the name of Congress, so it's sometimes called, erroneously, the Congressional Medal of Honor. For a while, civilians could and were awarded the Medal of Honor for actions such as rescuing a military person from a fire, which is a good deed. Thus, Buffalo Bill, a civilian scout, was qualified and received the Medal of Honor for action skirmish in which he was involved with up in the Platte River Valley, working with the Army, in April of 1872. However, in 1917, some 900, all civilians, which consisted of 911, if I remember my number correctly, were stripped of their Medals of Honor. This was a month after World War I began, or our participation in World War I began. I don't know if there's a connection there or not. The Medal of Honor system that we know today, one for the Army, one for the Navy, which includes the Marines and the Coast Guard, was established in 1943 with a clearer definition that it is awarded for valor and gallantry over and above the call of duty in combat. The Air Force version of the Medal of Honor was initiated in 1963. Now, who do we put on our plaque in Nebraska? Qualifications are Medal of Honor winners who were born in Nebraska, who were awarded the Medal of Honor for gallantry while serving in Nebraska, or who lived in Nebraska for 2 years, either before or after the time in which they were awarded the Medal of Honor. It's fairly broad. For example, the Nebraska Medal of Honor plaque includes Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker, the famed World War I fighter ace, who was certainly not a Nebraskan, but at some point apparently spent 2 years here. Former Governor and U.S. Senator Bob Kerrey is on that plaque, who won the honor as a medic in Vietnam. And Buffalo Bill is back up there. His medal was recalled in 1917, but in 1989, through the efforts of the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming, and with the assistance of, at that time, Representative, later Vice President Dick Cheney, that medal and 3 other scout medals of scouts were restored. Nebraska's most recent Medal of Honor winner is Lincoln-born Randall D. Shugart, a post-mortem award for gallantry in what became known as the Black Hawk Down battle in Somalia in 1993. And Sergeant Shugart was awarded that medal. He did not survive that battle. And in fact, it's important to note, I think, that some 60% of Medal of Honor winners, Medal of Honors are presented posthumously. It's probably fair to say that the primary issue or controversy over the Medal of Honor today concerns those soldiers that received the Medal of Honor for action in the Wounded Knee Massacre, and it was a massacre, on December 29th, 1890 on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. As shooting helpless women and children hiding in a ravine is not gallantry under any definition of such. I looked into the question of whether any of those Indian War Medal of Honor winners listed on the plaque, and all of these are grouped by war or conflict, whether any of the Medal of Honor winners listed on the plaque were so honored for their involvements at Wounded Knee, and found only one. I'm happy to find only one. Corporal William O. Wilson, an African-American soldier in the 9th Cavalry, whose citation reads, is pertaining to his work in carrying a message from his unit at Wounded Knee to the military headquarters that had been established at the Pine Ridge community. So he was not actively engaged in the conflict at Wounded Knee. The Native American community at large, and certainly the Lakota community, is strongly interested in recalling those medals of honor that were awarded for that action at Wounded Knee. I would personally support that. So there are what we have. We have 26 inductees. We have enough questions to keep anybody going who's interested in this, and enough. I have 5 minutes left. Well, that's time for questions. I have 2 members of the commission here, Dr. Ron Noggle, who is the chair, I believe, still, and Dr. Ron Hull. I don't think there's anyone else here, is there? But Bob Ripley is here, who's administrator of the Capitol Commission and is involved, of course, in one of the more interesting questions that remains, and that is, where do we put the future busts? The natural places we've pretty well filled up. That's a good job. The legislation says that the Hall of Fame is to be housed in the state capitol and other appropriate places in Nebraska, which I think is a good thing. We did work a couple years back to recall a couple of busts that had been out. We got those all back in the Capitol now. But certainly there's a question for the Commission and the Capitol Commission in the future, where to place these busts. I think that's not something that's impossible. We have some wonderful public museums in the state. This one, Nebraska Museum of Nebraska Art, for example, up in Kearney, that places that these could be put. Because in the Capitol, they're only seen by the people who come to the Capitol. And I would comment that I was up in the Capitol taking some of these pictures on a sunny morning around the 1st of December, a Saturday morning, and the place was teeming with people. A lot of these were families coming up to have their pictures taken, the Christmas pictures taken. And they were using the halls, east-west halls, where the statues are located. I thought that was great. And a father and his 2 sons came along, and they were looking at each of the statue, and the bust, and the father was commenting on them. But of course, that raised another question in my mind, one the commission has also dealt with: how do we make more information about this available? How can we get the word out that these? Because I'm not sure the father and sons, they read it, but I'm not sure they stopped and thought about, these are significant Nebraskans that you young people and your children should look up to and learn from. So I think that whole education thing is another thing that the commission will be looking forward. And the third is minority representation in the Hall of Fame. This has been an issue that through the nomination of Malcolm X, which has come up 2 or 3 times, who lived in Nebraska, whether he should be qualified or not, but looking for that African American who are young African American children can look up to in that Hall of Fame, I think is a challenge that really needs to be addressed. And that challenge will continue as we look for larger and larger minority populations, immigrant populations here in the state. So there are plenty of things to keep the commission busy, to keep those of us who are interested in the Hall of Fame busy and thoughtful, and hopefully you. And I think I have time for maybe one question. Bob?
Do you have a sense of how many states, you mentioned it early on, how many states in the Union really have a Hall of Fame on a statewide basis?
There's 8 states that have some, how many states in the Union have a Hall of Fame? I only partially researched that. There are 8 states, according to a website which lists all kinds of Halls of Fame. There are 8 states that have something, a Hall of Honor, a Hall of Fame, a Walk of Honor, that seem to be statewide. 8 states. California has one. I think Alabama has one. A lot of states have athletic halls of fame, broadcasting halls of fame, and we have those too, of course. But an actual statewide Hall of Fame, the one that I mentioned earlier, was South Dakota, because it does exactly just that. The others we could research, yes. Good question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered if they're considered permanent parts of the Capitol building, because perhaps you could consider mounting a traveling show, to some place in Washington, if not the Capitol, some other museum or something.
Yes, they are in the Capitol. They are placed there really under the authority of the Capitol Commission. It has the authority to decide what statuary goes into the Capitol. But no, they don't have to be there permanently. They could actually travel, I think, which would not be cheap, but would be exciting. The question was, can they leave the Capitol? And yes, they can. The bust of Morton we found when we got to looking for it was down at the Lead Lodge in Nebraska City, where it was brought out every Arbor Day, and a toast was raised to it. And we suggested, well, why don't you make a copy, and we'll take the original back. And several of the most recent busts, there have been 2 copies made. Dr. Bessie is in Morrill Hall, for example. The official bust is in the Capitol, and I am told I am out of time. Thank you for coming.